Good morning. I'd like to welcome you here. It's great to see everybody, and you found the room. That was probably the biggest challenge, right? That's good. Well, I just a short note so that people are understanding something. We have want to welcome several visitors from Japan, and they have taken a person along, or some people along, who will be interpreting for them. So if you see people whispering at the table, they're not being rude, they're doing things just the right way. So just so you know that, welcome, we're glad that you're here. My name is Barb Newman, and I am a church and school consultant for an organization called CLC Network. So I get to spend a lot of time going from different Christian schools to different churches to help give strategies for including people with disabilities. And this is my partner, Erik today.
Hi, I'm Erik. I'm actually an assistant professor of special education and rehabilitation psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I'm not your usual presenter at a worship symposium, but my work is around how do we weave people with disabilities into the life of their communities, particularly their faith communities, and so that'll be part of our conversation today as we talk about interdependent churches.
One other thing, we've chosen a style today so that hopefully you leave with some very hands-on things that you could try on Sunday with people, be they children or adults. So this is intended to be very practical. That's why we have stuff here, and we're going to weave those through into the presentation. So hopefully give you information, but practical applications that you can also take back to your community. So I hope that you can take both away from our time together. And we want you to know that while we are using information and examples from the field of disabilities, because Erik and I are the most familiar with that area, we also know that there are other reasons why churches may need to become a little more inclusive. That may involve races, it may involve cultures, it may involve other issues that can tend to have people be more of an outsider than one that's woven into the community called the church. So we hope that you can take these strategies and apply them broadly to your community. You know your community the best, and so you'll have to translate these into that language of your church. So I wanted to begin by just telling you that I went to present at a conference the other day, and I pulled out my trusty Bible. And I have had this Bible tucked in my purse for a very long time. It's a small one, it fits nicely, and I pulled it out, and I realized that my world was shrinking. The Bible was damaged, something had happened, maybe it had gotten wet, but the words were getting smaller in my Bible. And my husband said to me, Barb, I don't think it's the Bible's fault, it's probably time to have your vision tested. So I thought, well, that's probably a good idea. I know they can tell if you're far-sighted, and if I remember this correctly, if you're far-sighted, it means you can see things that are far. If you're near-sighted, you can see things that are near, but they also have tests of perception, where you can look at something and you can decide if your mind makes sense of what you see. So have you ever been to somebody's house and they had one of those pictures up there that was like a design? And you're supposed to stare at it in the middle, and like dolphins are supposed to start jumping around. Have you seen those? Anyway, perhaps I need a test of visual perception. How about this one? Have you seen this picture before? Some of you have. How many of you, when you flash it up, happen to see a very young and beautiful woman in the picture? All right. How many of you, when I flash it up, happen to see an older woman with quite a large nose? Okay, both of those pictures are in there, but your mind interprets what it sees. Well, it occurred to me that when we're dealing with people who may be of a different culture or a person with a disability, one of the most important things is knowing how to look at that individual, how to perceive that person. And it seems to me it would be time well spent to figure out, we want to look at another individual, we would want to use what I would call God's eyes to look at that person, right? That we can wear a lens that God would use when he looks at us as his people, as his children. We would want to wear those same kind of eyeglasses when we looked at another person. And so we want to give you some practical strategies today for perhaps equipping your congregation to use God's eyes when they look at that person. We know that God's vision can be different than ours. There are examples of that in the Bible. Remember the story, of course, where Samuel went to anoint the next king of Israel, right? And it went to the house of Jesse and laid eyes on a person that definitely looked like a king, right? And one of Jesse's sons, and thought that would be the one. But God very specifically said no. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. God sees something different when he looks at an individual. And that's what we want to talk about today. What are some of the ways that God looks at his children, and how can we use God's eyeglasses when we view different people?
And I think there's sort of two parts to this idea of adopting God's vision for people and for our church. And one is that there are certainly many people outside of our congregational doors in the neighborhoods that lie right beyond our churches that would be considered strangers within our own congregations. They're unfamiliar to us, or they may seem to live differently or look differently or talk differently. And so we often see people in terms of their being strangers. And so one of the tasks that we're called to do is to see people not as strangers, but for the gifts that they have to bring, and the gifts that they already have that just may not be present in our congregations right now. And so I think that's one part of this page, is to take more time to refocus and think about people, not in terms of their differences, but the gifts that God has given them that might be brought to our community. But I think that's one side of the page. The other side is a challenge for our own congregations. And I think that task that we have is to really reflect deeply on our own congregations and whether our congregations really are places that are welcoming for strangers. Are they really the sort of place that someone would come who is different or is perceived to be different and would feel at home and feel welcomed? I think our congregations really aren't called to have a narrow doors in a sense, or kind of a tempered welcome, but really to, and I don't think actually most of us would think about our congregations that way. After all, everyone in our congregation feels welcome there, or they wouldn't be there. But there's a large number of people just outside of our doors, I think, who would love to be part of our congregational communities, but either have come and not felt welcomed, or perceived that they wouldn't be welcomed if they came. And so one of the challenges that we have on the other side, in addition to looking at people for their gifts and trying to recognize what those gifts are, is to do some reflecting about our congregation and determining how ready are we to receive those gifts, particularly people with disabilities. So that's part of what we'll be talking about today as well.
I said we were going to give many examples that you can take back. So I'm going to start one of those examples now. Please understand that we're going to weave many examples under this one example, so if you were actually doing it, you'd squish it together and do it in a shorter amount of time. But we've used this for the outline for today, and it happens to be used with something that my mother did, and it's her knitting. So I wanted to show you, I took along some examples of my mom's knitting, but here's the context. And this is how I often introduce it. Do you ever read the Bible and you come across a word or a phrase that just jumps out at you, like you've never seen it before? And I was surprised to find out the other day as I was reading in Psalm 139 that God knows how to knit. Now, I could not knit. My mother tried to teach me, and that was not a successful experience, but my mom could knit very well. So I took along some of the items that she has knit over the years. This was one that my sisters and I would fight over. I had 4 older sisters, and we loved it. If you can see from the front, my mother changed yarn so many times. It's very warm. It's like wearing a triple thick sweater. So it was particularly helpful. We called it the Joseph coat because it was very colorful and had lots of different yarn. This one also was a nice sweater, not nearly as thick, but it had some nice colors to it. And not the same switches, but it was very nice for just a cool day. You didn't need this on the very coldest days, but my mom made this as well. But she loved to knit for her grandchildren, and this is one thing, and it's an authentic original, and I'll show you why. It has been loved to pieces, right? And thankfully I was able to salvage this much of it. My other son's is about this big and gray. But anyway, this was something she loved to do. Again, it's not at all colorful, but it was one of the softest items that she ever knit. Well, of course, we know that God does not knit sweaters. God knits people, right? But yet uses incredible diversity as he does that knitting. And that's going to serve as our outline for what we want to talk about. I love this phrase here. Again, the verse that it came from was Psalm 139. For you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. And that's the reference for what we're going to talk about. One of the things that I think we want to look at today are some of the similarities between my mother's knitting and God's knitting. So we're going to do that. I know one of the most important parts is that we are indeed made with a unique design. My mom made these very uniquely. You know, some very colorful, others not. But they were constructed with textures and yarns that would make sense and are so unique in creation. Well, that's true with people as well. Even if you look around this room, we're probably missing some of the younger ones that are part of God's design, but as people, we are unique, not only on the outside, but also on the inside. One of the joys that I have in my work is to spend time with, in particularly, children, and getting to know who they are. And one of the processes that we use is, after we've maybe done some observations and some other gathered information and done some testing, we sit down with a green and pink marker, and we put together information about that person. We color those things that are gifts, the areas of growth, the strengths, we color those green. In the areas that are difficult, hot spots, more frustrating for that individual, we color in pink. And it is interesting, we've tested and spent time with lots of children and adults, and believe it or not, we think that God used green and pink yarn when he knit us together. Because every single person is a combination of gifts and needs, greens and pinks. That's who we are. That's how he decided to weave us together. And so just to give a little illustration of that, I put together on this screen a number of different areas we might look at in a person as we're testing them. We might look at how are they at paying attention. Is that a green part? Let's be honest here. Who here would say that they are green? That's a strength, paying attention. Anybody here going to give them a green that's easy for you? How many of you would say that's a pink hot spot for me? I'm not so great at paying attention. All right, how many aren't voting because they don't want to tell? Okay, there we go, that's all right. Well, so you can kind of go through here and talk about things that are easy for you and things that are difficult. And of course, in the middle, I put those gifts that God gives to us, the gifts of his Spirit. Maybe it's teaching or encouragement, compassion, those sorts of things. Well, I want to divulge my greens and pinks to a certain degree. If I were to take those tests, you would find out that I'm very green in words. I love words. I love to say them. I love to write them. I love to read them. I love to play with them. I love Scrabble and Boggle and Quiddler. Words are me. Pink for me would be anything that requires eye-hand coordination. So that part that says, understanding what I see, with the eyes up here, that's very difficult for me. And so my children always want me to play those PlayStation, Xbox games with them with the controllers because they will always win, right? That's a pink spot for me. And if they were having tonight, the first ever in the snow softball game for the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship Symposium, I would not be a star player on that team, okay? I could cheer, but I'm not going to play on that team. That's my puzzle piece, or a portion of it. Because I would like you have a pink puzzle piece and a green puzzle piece on your handout today. Would you just look at that a minute, and I'll keep this slide up. Would you think about your own knitting pattern that God used? What are green parts for you? What things are easy? What are gifts? And they might be up here, they might not be up here. And then what are pink parts for you? Just take a minute to fill out those puzzle pieces and reflect on who you are. So you don't have to turn in the papers or anything when you're done, so be honest.
That's so pink. It's scarlet.
Well, you can continue to reflect on that if you want, but I think it's a really important place for us to begin. You see, some of the things in our world have initials or letters that go with the pink parts, right? If you really have trouble with social relationships, somebody may say, well, it's to the degree that that person has autism or Asperger's syndrome, and they might give it a word. Some of us have pink parts, like video games. They didn't give me a name for that, right? They don't look at me and say, well, that woman is video game impaired, right? Mine doesn't have a label. But some people do. But the truth is, we all have greens and pinks, do we not? And I think that is one of the most important pieces in places for people to begin. Now, I've embedded this under this sweater example, but this is actually a thing that I do in lots of churches and in lots of church schools, to have people fill this out, to actually make a puzzle piece that represents who they are. We'll talk a little bit more later how we can use that, but Erik's going to talk a little bit more about some of the diversity that you might see in God's knitting pattern in his people. But we need to approach this from the fact that we're all green and pink individuals, and that's been part of God's design in us.
One of the things that we've wanted to emphasize in this session is the importance of a church that is welcoming and uses the gifts of all people in a community. And I brought up the idea of strangers, those people who are strangers to our congregation, because there are lots of people in our communities who are strangers to our congregation. And I think in most communities or most congregations, people with disabilities are often the most obvious example of that. And so I wanted to share with you just a little bit about God's creativity in designing us. Obviously, in any congregation or even in this room, there's great diversity in the gifts that we have. There's as much diversity as there are numbers of people, and that's true in every congregation. But I think our congregations don't always reflect the diversity that actually exists in our neighborhoods right outside the doors of our congregation. I wanted to share with you a little bit about God's creativity in designing people. And I don't know if you knew that in America, for example, there are 7 million people with developmental disabilities. Those are people with labels like autism or labels like Down syndrome or intellectual disabilities. In fact, about 2 to 3% of any community has that label of a developmental disability. So if we were to use Grand Rapids as an example, since we're here, there's about 200,000 people in Grand Rapids. That means there's 6,000 children and adults with developmental disabilities in this city alone, right? So it raises those questions as we look at our congregations. Are 2 to 3% of our congregations reflective of people with developmental disabilities? Or more broadly, people with disabilities in general, there's actually about 19 to 20% of the population has some kind of disability. So again, if we looked at Grand Rapids, where there's 200,000 people, that means there, I've got to do my math this morning, which I wasn't planning on doing at a worship institute, about 40,000 people with disabilities in this city alone. In this state, which has 10 million people, there are 2 million people with disabilities and 54 more million people with disabilities in this country. And that's true across countries, wherever you are. So there's a large percentage of our communities that have disabilities. As we look at our own congregation, is that reflected in our pews and on our worship teams? Do 20% roughly of people have developmental disabilities? And you may not know this as well. This is also an interesting fact, I think, that goes along with that idea, is that there are 21 million families in the United States who have some relative with a disability of some kind. 21 million families. That's 1 in every 4 families. So how many of you, by a show of hands, go to a congregation that has more than 4 families? Right. So again, the issue of disability and diversity, whether it's actually present in our worship spaces and in our congregations, is a reality for the people who are part of our congregations. And God designed it to be that way, but he also designed our churches to reflect that diversity as well.
And one strategy that Erik and I want to pass on to you, something that we have found to be incredibly helpful, and that is sometimes what a congregation needs in order to be welcoming and accepting is called information. In fact, I was having breakfast just this morning with somebody in the Prince Conference Center, and she just poured her heart out to me and said, well, my brother has bipolar and depression, and the churches he has attended want nothing to do with him. As we were talking about it, it's like, well, that's not really true. They know that they want him there. They're just not quite sure how to include and welcome him. And so one of the things that we have found to be incredibly helpful is called information. So I've actually written a book with information that you can pass on to children. It's called Helping Kids Include Kids with Disabilities, and it's great for a Sunday school class where you can, it's a lesson that helps people understand who that individual may be. We also decided to package up this puzzle piece with a lesson plan and supplies because this has been helpful middle school, high school, and adults. And so if you're looking for a way to give some information in a way that honors each person being made in God's design, these might be helpful tools for you. But I just wanted to give you an example. I went to a church and just talk about information being helpful. It was in the middle of a sermon, and the pastor was giving his message, and all of a sudden in the back I heard, "Stop! No, don't!" Very loud. And of course everybody, because it's during the sermon, everybody goes, and they turn around to see what's happening, right? This took exactly 15 seconds of intervention, and this is what this very smart pastor did. Smile on his face. He said, "Oh, I wanted you to meet my new friend, Marie. Her parents gave me permission." That's very important, by the way. You can't give out information about people unless you have correct permission. Her parents gave me permission to let you know that she loves coming to church, and she happens to have autism. Sometimes there are certain things that bother her, like the tags in her clothes, or a sound she might hear. And you know what? Today, I just want to count her as my cheering section. And he went right on with the message. About 5 minutes later, same thing happened. "Stop! No, don't!" in the back. Do you know how many people do you think turned around at that point?
Nobody.
Nobody. Because they had the information that they needed to interpret. They had the eyeglasses to better understand what was happening. Information is powerful. And so that's one really important strategy. I would dare guess that if this woman that I was talking about with her brother, if that church had some information about bipolar disorder and depression, if they understood that this person's unique giftings and his needs, a good conversation starter to have with this person, a good person to call if they had questions, be a powerful tool. I have a set of keys on here because that's something I'll often use if I'm explaining a person who may have autism. Those examples are all in here, and they're just different tools that you can use. Puzzle pieces, sweaters, sets of keys, or just what that pastor did so beautifully and gracefully. It took about 15 seconds. Everybody was equipped and armed with a pair of eyeglasses that they needed to better interpret that situation. So, made with a unique design, sometimes just sharing God's uniqueness in that individual can be a powerful message. And also, sharing some of those statistics that Erik shared with your congregation can be very helpful for the congregation to know there are lots of people sitting home this morning that should be here in our community. All right, so my mom's sweaters made with a unique design, God's knitting were made with a unique design, but I also think that mom's sweaters and God's knitting are made for a very specific purpose. This was the baby blanket, but my mom, when they graduated from high school, made all of the grandchildren an Afghan. Now, do you think they look like this? No, different purpose, right? They were much larger. They were vibrant in colors, and if it was a guy or a girl, she would pick the yarn. Of course, my poor mother knit mostly for males. That was tended to be the grandchildren were all males except for one. But so it was one of those things that was a delight. And but I think sometimes when you look at an individual with a disability, it's easy to see an all pink person. Have you noticed that? It's like you meet a person who might have Down syndrome and you see, oh, that's Down syndrome Ryan, or that's cerebral palsy Sue. It's like that's who that person is. But that's not God's design in that person. That person has been made in God's image to, hand knit by Him to fill a specific purpose in God's kingdom. And our knitting patterns, I think, are often one of God's ways for putting us into His community to fulfill that purpose in our life. I wanted to just give one example from my own life. We have a drama group, and I don't know how many of you have seen the CLC Network's drama team? Some of you have. It's an inclusive group so that each member of the team who has a disability has one or two friends that they bring along from their life, and we do a drama in different churches. It's a wordless drama because some of the members of the group don't speak very well to be able to communicate, but their actions communicate beautifully with some music. And one of the things, one of the members of this group, his name is Jonathan, and Jonathan, if I had to tell his green and pink parts, is quite an actor. He's passionate about the things of God. He loves Jesus. He's a prayer, and I know I've been with him enough that if I'm having a down day, Jonathan senses it immediately, and he will set his hand on my shoulder and he will pray for me. He knows where to go when somebody's hurting. Difficult for him, pink would be language and articulation. He happens to have Down syndrome, and so some of the words are more difficult for him to get out. But you know what? He plays the role of Jesus in this drama. And if you've seen this drama, or even if you haven't, I want you to know it's a story about the salvation message, the physical body of Christ. But because of who Jonathan is, he can also communicate a message about the body of Christ, God's church, in a way that nobody else can communicate. God has gifted him specifically, and quite honestly, the fact that he has Down syndrome is probably part of the green part for this play. It equips him, it allows him to function in this role and communicate something that others simply could not communicate. So we're made for a specific purpose. Erik has a few more examples as well.
I think we're often very quick to recognize how sort of our welcome as a church and our hospitality and friendship and those sorts of things can be good for people with disabilities or people who are strangers to our congregation. But I think probably just as important, but what we too often overlook, is how the friendship and the gifts and the embrace of people with disabilities are really good for us or anyone who's different. That it's really our lives that are probably just as likely to be transformed when we reach out and take the time to get to know people who we perceive to be different or have various labels that society attaches. And I think we're also very quick to overlook specifically the gifts of people with disabilities and many others in our community. I know my history has been to make judgments about very quickly about who I do and don't have something to learn from. And that's particularly true, I think, around individuals with developmental disabilities. We often focus our ministry to people who are different from us, rather than trying to do ministry with or worship with or do ministry alongside those people. So I get to work with a lot of churches around that are sort of journeying along what it means to welcome a greater segment of their community, particularly people with developmental disabilities. And I get to hear a lot of stories about the gifts that people with disabilities bring that too often are surprising gifts to those of us in congregations. There's actually at our church, there's a greeter with intellectual disabilities. Actually, he only has intellectual disabilities in school. That's the label they've given him, certainly not in our congregation. And he's been a greeter for probably longer than anyone else, and he's the greeter that everyone knows. He kind of approaches you with that knuckle-cracking handshake and picks up the conversation exactly where it left off last Sunday with great enthusiasm. So you truly feel welcomed when you come to that church. It's not that he has a developmental disability that makes that gift great. It's the fact that he has a developmental disability in many congregations would have prevented him from ever having that opportunity to serve in that way. I was at a church recently that's still talking about the scripture and songs that were conveyed through sign language in such a beautiful way that illustrated God's message to that church in a way that they hadn't heard before, and they still are remembering and reflecting on that gift that that individual who was deaf shared with them. I also think about particularly a family from a church that I was visiting just a few months ago, who a young couple who had just found out that their soon-to-be child would have Down syndrome when the child was born, and was wondering what to do about that, and what decision should they make about that. And when they went to a church that they were visiting for the first time, they saw a young man with Down syndrome up on the stage leading part of worship services. And they'd never seen that in any place before, and that made their decision for them when they saw that their child would have gifts that could be shared within the kingdom. I also think about a church that I had a chance to work with when I was in college, and we had what was called a friendship class at the time that involved several people with developmental disabilities and a number of college students and others who didn't have disability labels. And there were individuals in that group who served in really important ways within that congregation. One was a choir member, another was an usher. These were individuals, as I said, with labels like autism and developmental disabilities. Another, a young man, his responsibility was chief assistant to the pastor. He was responsible for making sure there was a cup of water always ready for the pastor. And he was the first one to give the pastor feedback at the end of the sermon about whether it was really an effective sermon or not. It's probably the only honest feedback that pastor ever got. But what struck me about that isn't that those gifts are extraordinary, because they're in every congregation. What struck me is, as I learned and developed friendships with these individuals with disabilities, how far they had to travel each Sunday morning to that church, because there weren't churches along the way that would welcome them and receive their gifts. And I think that lesson has been most profound for me personally, because when I think about my own life and my own faith journey, I grew up in the church, and I grew up in places with wonderful teaching and preaching and wonderful youth groups. But it wasn't for me until I heard the very unrushed and patient testimony of 3 adults with developmental disabilities that I became a Christian and gave my life to Christ. I had heard that message many times, but I hadn't heard it in the same way. But from these individuals with developmental disabilities, people who would most, I think, by society, be most likely considered to be the least likely conduits for God's grace on people's lives. So I think the message here is that people have gifts, and I've never met a congregation that if they discovered someone's gifts, they couldn't find a place to use that. For every congregation that has not been able to figure out a way to use a person with disabilities' gifts in their congregation, there are others that have figured it out. And so that tells me that it's our creativity and our willingness as congregations to take those efforts, and not that the problem resides within people with disabilities.
One other, just a practical thought to give to you as you interact with individuals. Quick story from my own life, and this involves school, but please understand that if you are a parent who has a child with a disability, or if you are an adult who is a sibling to or an adult with a disability, sometimes life can be a bit discouraging, right? These are individuals that Erik mentioned that have been empowered, right? They have been empowered to serve within their community. There are many that are sent away and not welcome in those places. And I guess what I wanted to leave with you is that sometimes it's helpful to use Jeremiah 29 and do that with people. I know I needed that one day. I went to parent-teacher conferences, and one of my sons is just knit beautifully to fit with school, right? My other son in school do not get along, okay? He has several issues in his life that make school not his preferred place to be. And they have to do with some learning disabilities and some attention deficit issues, as well as, believe it or not, having quite a high IQ. Sometimes that's not always a bonus. When your body can't perform the way your brain is thinking, sometimes that can be difficult. So you add in a few other issues, and that's my second son. And I went to parent-teacher conferences, and high school's lovely. You get 5 minutes with 6 teachers in a row, right? So I went to each teacher, and they know what I do, right? I mean, most people say, you're the teacher consultant, can't you pick your own kid, right? That was kind of the idea. I walked from room to room, and every time it was like, oh, I have no clue what I'm gonna do with him. Do you have any suggestions? And they kept telling me all the things that he could not do. They spent more time telling me about his paint parts, that when I finally got to the last conference, to the last teacher, that person looked at me, and before she could get her word in, I said, would you please tell me anything positive, something, one thing positive about my son, okay? And her face lit up and she said, you haven't heard any of that? Oh my goodness. And she went on to just portray how she saw the green part of my son. And we both knew there was enough paint to go around. But her eyes, her vision was focused on that. Sometimes it is really helpful for a Sunday school teacher to go to a parent that they just dropped off their child and they might have had a pretty wild ride in Sunday school, but to say to that parent, oh my goodness, what a treat to have your child. You know, never met anybody with quite that much energy or whatever. This child was very engaged, or my goodness, they loved this song. We can dwell on that green And sometimes I call that doing Jeremiah 29:11 with somebody. I know the plans I have for you and your child and your special person, or whatever that may be. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Let me tell you, people in the disability world hear lots about their pink parts, how many degrees below zero they are, how sub this, how ab this. And we as a church can speak up and say, you know what? We see your child. We see you. We see this adult for who you are. You are a gift to us from God, and we see that green. So let me encourage you to look for that green, to do Jeremiah 29:11 with people. Sometimes when they come to you, they've lived in a world of all pink, and they need somebody to recognize the green part that God's given to them. All right, so my mom's sweaters. Remember I told you this example was kind of woven throughout, right? We've talked about being made with a unique design, being made for a specific purpose, but I also want to talk a little bit about being made with a label. I will tell you, my mother passed away about 1.5 years ago, and this is one of my treasures, because in here is the label that says handmade by May Bandstra. Oh, I treasure this. You know what? Somebody else could have had the same yarn and knitting needles. It would have turned out differently. This is my mom's creation. And she labeled that as her artwork. And God does the same thing with us. And I want to illustrate this. And this, by the way, is something that I've used in several churches. And so Erik and I want to share this example today. I don't know about you, but in my wallet right now, I have something I call the dregs of gift cards. Do you know what that is? Like, you go get a gift card, you go to the store and you buy something for $19.97, and they hand that card back to you with $5.03 left on the card. Well, there is nothing in that store that costs $5.03, right? So you just are hunting in the papers or looking for that day when they set up a sale day, right? And they establish some kind of a bargain table or a bargain rack, right? You're eager, you go in there, but some clerk went through all the stuff in that store and said, oh, that one's kind of got a stain on it, this one's got, a crack. We'll put it on the bargain table, right? It's got to be discounted because it's not quite worth the other merchandise that's in the store. But hey, maybe, I can find something for my $5.03 on that table and, use a little bleach or something, super glue, and it'll make it okay. But I'll tell you what I think tends to happen. It tends to happen sometimes that we put people on the bargain rack or the bargain table. Have you noticed that? Like, you meet somebody out in the world, right? And you decide very quickly whether they are somebody you'd like to walk past, or do you need to walk to the other side of the road because maybe you don't trust them. Could be the clothes they're wearing. You might meet two people and you might say, well, that one looks very athletic and that one certainly doesn't. So one person is worth more, they're more valuable than the other person. And so we put that other person on the bargain table. Maybe you see a person and their friend is in a wheelchair, and you make the judgment very quickly. Well, one person, is whole and the other person is flawed, and therefore belongs on the bargain table. Our brains do it very quickly, and we almost have to fight against that. And I'll tell you, that happens a lot in the world of disabilities, and Erik's going to talk about that. Although I will say, Erik and I are well versed in this area of disabilities. There are many issues that tend to give us permission to put people on the bargain table in life. And you may be in a church where you can identify very quickly that person or that group of people that may be on the bargain table.
Right, I think, as we've emphasized, the labels and gifts that God gives us draws us in and shows us how we can contribute to the larger body and community. But the labels that society often gives have the opposite effect. The label of a disability is not at all a reliable predictor of a person's aspirations. People with disabilities, like all of us, want the same things. They want meaningful relationships, involvement in their community. They want a comfortable and safe place to live, a satisfying job, a place to belong, a best friend, right? Chance to give something back, and an opportunity to worship and to learn and to serve alongside others. They have the same desires for worship and growth and direction, and they share the same need for community and connectedness and belonging. So I think labels are often used to highlight what's different about people, but really I think it's more helpful to think about what we have more in common. That being said, even though people with disabilities don't have different aspirations, the life outcomes of many people with disabilities are very different, and disability is a predictor of the experiences people have in all areas of life, including in our congregations. So I've given all of you a handout that on one side has a picture of the United States, on the other side has some findings from a recent National Organization on Disability and Harris poll from 2004. And what it shows is it's a national survey that shows outcomes in very different aspects of life for people with disabilities, different severities of disability as well, versus people without disabilities. And I want to highlight some of those to show you what the impact of societal labels can have, and as a challenge for our churches not to represent or reflect those societal labels. But in the area of employment,
Do you need those back there?
there's some.
So you have some
She's
left?
got some, and she'll pull those around.
Thank you.
But in the area of employment, only 35% of people with disabilities are employed part-time or full-time, versus almost 80% of people without disabilities. They're twice as likely to drop out of school. They're 3 times as likely to live in poverty. They're twice as likely to have inadequate transportation. They're twice as likely to go without needed health care. And they're half as likely to say that they're very satisfied on various life satisfaction ratings. So there's a big gap that follows from that disability label that we attach. And that gap is also present in our congregations. That same survey shows that many people live not only on the outskirts of their communities, but also on their faith communities. In one of the recent surveys, it said they found that 65% of people without disabilities attended church at least once a month. Now, I know that's kind of the minimum level of church involvement, right? All of you would expect more than once a month. But 65% attend once a month, versus only 45% of people with significant disabilities. That's a 20 percentage point gap. So why is that gap there? Why are so few people with disabilities involved in our congregations? If you're tempted to think it's because of differences in the importance of faith in their lives, it's absolutely not the case. The very same survey asked people how important their religious faith was to them, and exactly the same number of people, 84% of people with disabilities and without disabilities, said their faith was just as important. So that label is translating into a big gap even within our congregations, and the gifts of many people, a sizable number of people in our communities, aren't having the opportunity to be shared within our worship space and our worship time within our congregational communities. And so I think one of our emphasis is our congregation should be at least one place where that gap doesn't exist. And that's the challenge that we have through this presentation to share with you.
And so to kind of finish up this example at least, I guess we are made with labels, aren't we? They don't happen to be cerebral palsy, but when we become Christians, and even before we've given our lives to Jesus, we do get a label from God, don't we? In fact, we have several. His children, the people in our room, and I guess if God is looking at us, what does he see? He sees honored members of the body of Christ. He sees us as salt and light of the world. He sees us as important and secure. We're heaven-bound travelers with brothers and sisters for the road together. We're dearly loved children of God. Oh my goodness. Indispensable image bearers of God. You could create a huge frame. But when God looks at us, you know what? That is what he sees. And if we're to use God's eyes when we look at another individual, I believe we need to see that frame of words around that person. So I've made a name tag for you today. Did you get them on your table? You see, your name goes right in the middle of all those words, doesn't it? That's who you are. If you're a Christian, if you've given your life to Jesus, that's who you are. But the same is true for my friend Marie, who could only move her eyes. She's given her life to Jesus as well and was baptized in a church as an adult. That is the one body movement over which she has control. And she will blink to tell a yes-no system. She's passionate about Jesus. She's also very good at keeping any prayer requests confidential. We use her in that way all the time. She just, she will laugh. She knows inside because her mouth doesn't always reflect what she's thinking either. But just a dearly loved person. See, that frame of words is around her as well. And so I would say that the labels that God gives us actually prohibit us from ending up on a bargain table, any one of us. Because how can you be a dearly loved child of God, important, and be a discounted person? Do those even go together? No. You can't do that, can you? And so this is our protection against the bargain table, and it is a gift from God. It's nothing we earn. Salvation's a gift, and so is this ring of words. It is his gift to us. So I think that's really important, that our bodies stand within those labels from God, and those are the ones we need to see wrapped around the gifts that God brings into our community. Okay, finally, the other similarity between my mom's knitting and God's knitting, I think has to do with the fact that we are made to be part of a larger collection. You know, my mom didn't knit 16 of one kind of sweater. She never knit me any underwear, because that wouldn't work, right? You need a wardrobe that's much more diverse. You need different pieces that go into place. And I think that that same thing is true when we look at the puzzle pieces. You see, we're all made to be part of a larger collection. God made us, as we bring our green and pink puzzle piece, you see, to fit together. He actually, when he designed us, he made us to need each other, right? So that where I'm strong, I can come along and help somebody else, right? And where they may be strong, they can come along and help me. We're a giant body puzzle that fits together. And I just wanted to give a few examples of this, because the truth is, we're far stronger stuck together than we are apart. And so I wanted to give an example, but also challenge you to think about this. We've had churches actually use this example. Everybody made a puzzle piece, put their name on it. They displayed it in the front hallway. We are the body of Christ. Don't expect everybody to be all green, right? Because nobody is. That's not God's design. But we do need each person plugged in so that we can best function in this body here. I just wanted to share a story. Again, it's a personal one of my own life, but there are so many, and sometimes the ones that are personal to us impact us the most. My son John, a little bit about his puzzle piece, he loves music. Anything music is John. He is now 18. He has his driver's license, very responsible. We left both our boys home. I know that everything will be okay because John is at home right now, and he's just an obedient, responsible kind of guy. I know, too, when tests come around, I will help him study for math. That would be a pink part for him, not his gifted area, and and he's not very athletic at all either. That's his puzzle piece. He has a friend named Ryan. Ryan's puzzle piece, too, very green, very outgoing, loves to laugh, enjoys life, incredibly loyal, incredibly forgiving. And is very up on any episode that happens to be in the Star Wars series, has watched it multiple times, so is an expert on Star Wars. Pink for him would be anything that would have to do with speaking. He happens to have Down syndrome, and so words are hard for him. They don't always come out as other people would understand. So thankfully, John and Ryan have known each other since first grade, and they've chosen to put their puzzle pieces together. John can interpret basically anything that Ryan says at this point, or at least make a good guess, because they know each other very, very well. But it's easy for some people. John picked him up the other day and they went off to a movie together. John can drive, Ryan can't drive, and so John was giving him his green part. And it would be easy for somebody to come up to my son John and say, "John, how nice of you, how good to be so good to Ryan," right? Well, that's true. But it is equally as true that somebody needs to go up to Ryan and say, "How good of you to be so nice to that John Newman." Because the truth is, the puzzle piece between those two has changed both of their lives. John is a different person because of how God used Ryan to shape his heart. He is who he is because of this relationship. And in fact, one really neat just other story that I found out is we've known each other, again, John's 18, so is Ryan, and they've known each other since first grade. Actually, I think Ryan's 19 now. But found out that by grade 2, we had made Ryan's list. And it is the list of people that Ryan prays for by name before he goes to bed. We've been on that since second grade. That's a lot of years to be on Ryan's list. And because Ryan is who he is, he won't ever forget to pray for John, Jim, Barry, Barb. Because of the way he's wired, he will be incredibly faithful 365 days a year. I think about that as I give my son the car keys, and I think, okay, Ryan has covered John in prayer every single day, right? That is a gift that Ryan has brought to that relationship, and so many others. I think we need to think about that. We are designed to fit together in community. Erik has a few other examples of that.
Right, we are made to be part of a larger collection, and I love the 1 Corinthians 12 that speaks to this. I love the Message's paraphrase. It says, every person is given something to do that shows who God is. Everyone gets in on it. Everyone benefits. And then later on, if one part hurts, every other part is involved in the hurt and in the healing. If one part flourishes, every other part enters into the exuberance. How do we know if we're that kind of community where people's gifts are freely exchanged and people aren't known by their sort of societal labels, but by the labels God has given them, and known by their gifts and for what they can contribute? And a lot of the work that I get to do with churches around this issue, we've developed kind of a set of indicators or markers that might suggest that you're moving along that journey towards being that kind of place. And I wanted to share with you some of those as they relate particularly to individuals with disabilities and what that might look like. And the first indicator that you're the kind of place that receives everyone's gifts and allows people to know and be known by one another is simply presence. All right? I think inclusion just begins with presence. It's difficult to welcome people and to learn about their gifts and to benefit from their gifts if they're simply not part of our congregations. And so one thing that we can do is reflect on by looking around at our pews and on our ministry teams and in our children's programs, and to what extent are people with disabilities currently involved in our community. It's hard to exchange your gifts if people simply aren't there. So the first indicator is simply presence. The second is accessibility. All right? I think presence is a starting point, not certainly a place to stop. And so once people can get through your doors, are they able to participate in all the things that go on in your congregation, in your worship services, in all aspects of those? Are they physically able to do that? They have to actually not only be able to get in the building, but able to get around the building. So if a person, if your church is one that doesn't have elevators to get to your sanctuary, or there's no ramps to the raised portions of the stage, or there's no transportation or transportation's infrequently available, it's really hard for someone to move beyond just presence to actual participation. So that's the indicator of accessibility. The third kind of marker is hospitality and welcome, right? So I think you have to have an accessible building, but it's really through interactions and it's through relationships that people actually share their gifts and through which welcome is communicated. And so we have to be a place that's known for our hospitality to all people, including people with disabilities, and not just the easy hospitality that in our church happens for the 20 seconds when the pastor says, turn to your neighbor and welcome them, but really the meaty stuff that involves actually spending time together, doing things beyond just that Sunday morning. We all know that there's actually 7 days in a week, not just one, and part of showing welcome and hospitality is extending that beyond just the Sunday morning. So that's the third kind of indicator. Are people present? Are our facilities accessible? Are we showing welcome and hospitality? And I think the fourth is shared lives. Sharing lives is much more than just sharing common space. There's a difference between being in proximity to each other during worship and actually participating. So I think a welcoming congregation really strives to weave people with and without disabilities into a common community. A lot of times we start disability efforts as separate classes or separate worship services or separate Bible studies. And I think a more true reflection of the kinds of things we're talking about is when people with and without disabilities worship together and fellowship together and learn together and live together rather than parallel. And I think that's the difference between people with disabilities or other labels being present in our congregation, simply present, versus actually having a presence. There's a big difference between those two things. And it's also the difference between people just simply not being in our congregation and being absent and actually being missed. When we miss that they're actually not there, that's an indicator of shared lives. I think the fifth indicator is that these kinds of congregations that recognize that we're all part of a larger collection really focus on recognizing gifts and contributions. Everyone wants to feel like they have something to give and that they matter. But historically, at least, people with disabilities and other labels are really viewed by what they can't do. They're defined by what they can't do and by extension what they can't contribute. So I think welcoming congregations really strive to recognize the gifts of everyone in their community. Not only what can I do for people who are strangers to my community, but what do they have to bring to us? what are the gifts that they have to share that we can learn from. So I think one of the things we can do as we look around our worship time is we look at the ministry teams, we look at the pulpit in the choir loft on the worship team, who's passing the offering plates, who's passing the peace, who's welcoming members, who's reading the scriptures, and our people with disabilities sharing their gifts in those same ways that other people are in our congregation. I think a sixth indicator is that we're proactive, that welcoming congregations start to think about in advance about who might walk through their doors. Because if we're not thinking ahead of time about who's going to come and how to welcome them, we're unlikely to get a second chance to welcome them when they return. And I think, if we're waiting till people arrive to figure out how to make them a part of our congregation, we've probably waited too late, I think. So that's the sixth indicator. The seventh is a willingness to learn. I think in most congregations, and it's true in my congregation, the people, as we look around our pews, the backgrounds and experiences of everyone look pretty similar oftentimes. And I think we wrestle with what it looks like to really welcome people who are different or perceived to be different in some way. So part of the response is throwing open the doors wide open and extending new invitations to people, and that can be an uncomfortable place for us, and we might not be sure how to proceed. So I think the indicator is that you're willing to learn how to do that, and willing to make mistakes, and to strive to do better, and to be more responsive, and to live out that call more fully. And then the eighth indicator, I think, that is something that we can reflect on is the issue of reciprocity. Just like everyone else, people with disabilities or any kind of label want to contribute and make a difference within their congregations. And so congregations that strive to equip all of their members to learn about their gifts and find ways of deploying them are congregations that are moving along on this journey. People with disabilities in particular are often viewed as the designated recipients or the designated perpetual objects of ministry. And in a congregation that really gets this, everyone has a chance to minister to and to be ministered by. And those roles of servant and the one served aren't static, but change over time. So I think those are some of the indicators that congregations might be looking for: presence, accessibility, welcome, recognizing contributions, proactive efforts, willingness to learn, and a sense of reciprocity that help you move along this journey to being a kind of larger collection that really recognizes everyone's gifts.
We know that later today I'm going to do a sectional very focused on autism in the church. Again, very specific information and strategies for that particular area. Numbers are 1 in 150 for autism, so you can decide if you have anybody with autism, Asperger's, on that label in your church community. Erik is going to do one later on this afternoon. A lot of the information he's given will be expanded so that you can learn more about creating that kind of a community of welcome. So I hope you take advantage of that. I'm going to just do one other quick plug before I finish up the sweater example for the day and leave you with one other Bible verse you could share with your own congregations. So what do we do? How do we start this? Is there a manual to follow, some step-by-step process where we can get to know an individual puzzle piece and then plug that person? CLC Network has worked very hard to revise and put this into place, and it's called a glue manual. Again, it's a very step-by-step process for how you can get to know that individual and set up a plan for that person to be plugged into the church. We happen to have an exhibit with Erik's book and some of the things that I've written, puzzle pieces and a lot of other things up on the exhibit level of the Fine Arts Center. We're tucked inside a room, so I'm going to tell you we're inside room 220 along with Hope Publishing. So if you walk around, you got to peek inside that classroom, you'll see us there. All right, just wanted to talk, final thing, sweater example, about receiving the gift. I had a choice when my mom, she'd spent months knitting different things, and she would, call me into the room, Barb, here is this sweater, and I had a choice. I could either say, this is awesome, Mom, thank you so much, it's beautiful, I can't wait to wear it tomorrow, I'm gonna put it in a treasured spot. Or I could say, oh, sick, you have got to be kidding, I am never gonna wear that piece of garbage. Might as well just give it away, throw it in the trash. I am never gonna put on that piece of clothing. How do you think my mom would feel? Any chance I'd get another sweater anytime in my life? Probably not. Well, I think God offers us, his children, with a similar way. And we have a choice to make. When that person comes to our community, we can either as a congregation say, oh, sick, you've got to be kidding. I have to put that person here in this pew beside me? I don't think so. You mean I'd have to change something to welcome that person here in this community? I don't think that's gonna happen. Just, go to another place, just maybe down the road, whatever, but don't stay here. How do you think God's heart feels when he has prepared, knit together this individual and placed them? God has in fact arranged each part of the body, right? Arranged this person to make your puzzle stronger in your congregation. Or we can receive that person with joy. Thank you. Can't wait to find out more about you. We know that you are God's unique design, and he's placed you here to be a gift to our community. We're excited about that. Final example I'll often use, children and adults. Tell me some ways you could praise God. Kids are good at this. Singing, right? Reading the Bible, praying, whatever they're going to say. I said, do you know that you can praise God without ever singing a note? In fact, would you guys like to make heaven a noisier place? So I'm going to ask you the same question. Would you guys like to make heaven a noisier place at your church? Let me tell you how. Do you know that every time you welcome that person who's been in that percentage sitting around your congregation but at home because they didn't think there was a home for you, there's a shout of praise in heaven. Accept one another then, just as Christ accepted you in order to bring praise to God. Do you know that, by the way, you pull somebody's puzzle piece in and plug it into your congregation, somebody who might be unacceptable by the world standards on some kind of bargain table based on what the world says, but you find a place of honor and respect for that individual, there's a shout of praise in heaven. What about you? Are you ready to go back to your churches and make heaven a noisier place because of the way you accept and love each other? I see a show of hands. Who's here ready to make that happen in their congregation? That is great. I think we have a shot at making heaven a noisier place. Thank you so much for coming. Please, we want to give you continued opportunities this afternoon at the exhibits. If there are ways we can resource your church, that's what we want to do because we know this is God's heart. Let me close in a quick prayer and then you're free to make your way on to the next session. Lord God, these people from in this room gathered here are from all over the place, other countries, other states, some right here in this community. And we've heard from Erik, the numbers of people that are longing to find a place of welcome in your body. And we know you've already welcomed those individuals. Your arms are open wide, Lord, and we want to join you. We want our churches to join you in creating that place of welcome, place of honor, where each person can use his or her gifts to serve you, to serve one another. I pray that you will equip this group, give them your vision for what that looks like, whether that's for persons with disabilities, whether that's for persons from another race, another culture, whatever that may be, Lord God. Use this time together so that we do indeed make heaven a noisier place. We love you. Thank you for this group. In Jesus' name, amen.